I was having coffee with someone who was there on that night in Paris. We were just talking. And then a car backfired in the street. It was loud. And he didn't just jump. His entire body changed. It was like watching a switch get flipped. His eyes went completely still, his hands clenched, and for a solid second, he wasn't there with me. He was gone. And then, just as fast, he was back. He laughed it off. Sorry, still jumpy. Yeah. But what I saw wasn't jumpy. It wasn't a memory. It was a mechanism. It was a biological alarm still ringing years later that had hijacked his entire nervous system. That's the part we never talk about. This isn't a story about sad memories. This is a story about biology. That moment, I mean, that lightning fast, totally involuntary physical reaction, that's really the perfect entry point for today's deep dive.
It is, because we are going to try and shift the entire discussion about trauma away from, just an emotional story of pain and loss.
And focus instead on the concrete, the physical remodeling of the brain and the nervous system that trauma actually kicks off.
Exactly. The mission today is to look at trauma, specifically post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, as a physiological and structural issue. We are diving into some really hard neuroscience.
And we're using some incredibly sophisticated research, right? A lot of it coming from these massive studies done after events like the 2015 Paris terror attacks. We're looking for the underlying blueprint.
We are. And we've kind of broken it down into 3 interconnected areas.
Okay, what's the plan?
So first, we're going to establish the standard neurobiological blueprint of PTSD. We'll look at which key parts of the brain are failing and exactly how they're failing.
Okay, the basic damage report.
Right. Then second, we're going to pivot a bit. We'll look at how this damage can, in a sense, spread collectively.
You mean how intense repeated media exposure can start to create trauma symptoms in people who were never even there?
Precisely. In populations that were nowhere near the actual event. And finally, we get to what I think is the biggest paradox in the entire field. We know clinical therapy works. I mean, it works incredibly well for trauma. But when scientists put those same patients back in a brain scanner after successful treatment, do they see the fix? Do they see those broken brain structures getting back to normal?
Ah, so you're asking if psychological healing maps directly onto physical neurological healing.
And we're going to examine that evidence for what's called neural normalization. And as you're about to see, it's incredibly complex and honestly often frustratingly inconsistent.
All right, let's get into it. Part 1. The physical damage. Let's start with the basics of PTSD.
Well, it affects a pretty significant chunk of the population. In Western societies, the estimates are somewhere between, say, 1.1 and 2.9%.
And that number obviously can just skyrocket in places that have experienced conflict or a huge disaster.
Absolutely. Clinically, what defines it is that the person gets trapped. They're stuck. And this manifests in 4 primary symptom clusters.
Okay, what are...
First, you have re-experiencing the event. That's the flashbacks, the nightmares. Then there's active avoidance. Staying away from anything that reminds you of what happened.
People, places, conversations.
Anything. Third is the negative changes in thoughts and mood. A sense of detachment, guilt, blame. And finally, the 4th one is the one you described right at the top. Increased arousal.
The hypervigilance, that exaggerated startle response.
The feeling of being constantly on edge. The moment your friend's body seized up when that car backfired, his system was stuck in on.
So what's happening in the brain to cause that? What's the core idea?
The foundational neural hypothesis, and this is probably the most critical concept to get your head around for all of this, is the failure of what we call top-down regulation.
Top-down regulation. Okay, walk us through that. What does that mean in, simple terms for the brain's wiring?
Okay, so imagine you have 2 core systems in your brain. At the bottom, you have your primal survival brain.
The limbic system.
The limbic system, yeah. That's where fear and immediate raw emotion live. Then at the top, you've got your prefrontal cortex. That's the part behind your forehead responsible for logic, rationality, planning, control.
The CEO of the brain?
Pretty much. So in a healthy, well-regulated system, you encounter something frightening. An alarm goes off down in the bottom system.
No, a flight kicks in?
Instantly.
Instantly.
And within milliseconds, the top system, the prefrontal cortex, is supposed to step in, look at the big picture, assess the context, and say, wait a second, this is not actually a threat.
That was a car backfiring, not a gunshot.
Exactly. And it sends inhibitory signals down to shut that alarm off. It applies the brakes.
So the prefrontal cortex is the executive control. It's the rational assessor. It's the brakes on the emotional engine.
It is the brake pedal. And in the standard model of PTSD, that emotional brain, the limbic system, is chronically hyperactive. I mean, it's just firing all the time because those cognitive control centers up top have failed to inhibit it.
The brake pedal is being pushed, but it's worn out. It's fundamentally weak.
It's weak. The connection is frayed. The core dysfunction in PTSD is a lack of inhibitory control. The brakes are failing.
And we can actually map this dysfunction onto 3 key regions of the brain, all connected in this broken regulatory loop.
That's right.
Let's start with that faulty brake pedal itself. The medial prefrontal cortex, or mPFC. I've also seen it linked with the rostral anterior cingulate cortex, the RACC.
Yes, they're part of the same executive network. These are the critical control centers. They're absolutely vital for decision-making, for emotion regulation, and crucially for something called fear extinction.
Fear extinction. That's the process of learning that something that used to be dangerous is now safe, right?
It is. It's unlearning fear.
Yeah.
And these regions, the mPFC and the RACC, are supposed to modulate the activity of those lower-level emotional centers. They're supposed to be in charge.
So what do the brain scans, the fMRIs, tell us about these regions in people with PTSD?
What we see, and this is one of the most reliable neural correlates of the disorder, is consistent hypoactivation.
Hypoactivation.
Yeah.
Underactivity.
Exactly. They're sluggish.
Yeah.
At the very moment they should be lighting up and sending those powerful calm-down signals to quell the fear, they're running below capacity.
It's like the firefighters are slow to get to the station when the alarm rings.
That's a great analogy. And this inability to adequately activate is believed to be the root cause of that breakdown in top-down control. If your executive centers are underpowered, they simply cannot muster the force needed to override that screaming emotional alarm.
Okay, so the controller is asleep at the wheel. Now let's talk about the alarm itself. The amygdala, everyone's heard of it. The brain's core emotional processor, the fear center.
The engine of fear, yeah. And in PTSD, as you'd expect, the amygdala shows hyperactivation.
So it's overactive.
It's excessively active, highly reactive, overfiring. It is perceiving threat absolutely everywhere. It's the alarm that's been tripped, and now the reset button is breaking.
And this overreaction is what drives so many of the symptoms, like the flashbacks and that constant on-edge feeling.
It's a huge driver. But there's a really crucial distinction that researchers have been trying to tease out here.
Which is?
Is the hyperactivation of the amygdala a sign of PTSD itself? Or is it just a sign of having been exposed to trauma? Because not everyone who experiences trauma develops the disorder.
Ah, I see. So it might be a marker of the event, not the disorder.
Well, meta-analyses suggest that while hyperactivation is definitely there, it might be more closely related to the initial trauma exposure itself, rather than being the specific thing that defines the long-term development of PTSD.
That's a really important nuance.
It is. And what's even more important is the structural element. While the function of the amygdala is clearly overreactive, the morphology, that's the physical shape and volume of the amygdala, generally appears unaltered in PTSD.
Wait, so the structure itself is fine. It's not damaged or shrunken.
For the most part, no.
That offers a really profound insight, doesn't it? If the physical structure is okay, but the function is haywire, it means the problem is in the wiring and the chemistry, not the hardware.
Precisely. And that suggests the potential for functional recovery. It suggests normalization should be possible.
We can retrain the circuit.
That's the hope. And, we often talk about the amygdala as this one monolithic thing, but it's really the basolateral amygdala, the BLA, that's of particular interest.
Why that part specifically?
Because the BLA plays a huge role in fear acquisition, learning what to be afraid of. And its direct connections to the hypoactive mPFC are what make that whole fear extinction process, that unlearning, possible.
So the breakdown is happening on that specific highway between the BLA and the mPFC.
Understanding that interaction is absolutely key to understanding the fear circuit failure.
Okay, so we have the faulty brake, the mPFC, and the screaming alarm, the amygdala. Let's bring in the third critical region, the hippocampus, the memory center. Where does it fit in?
The hippocampus it's like the librarian. It's the context encoder. It provides the where and the when for every single memory you have.
So if file things correctly, this happened then in that place.
Yes. And critically, for our discussion, it's also necessary for the recall of that extinction memory.
The safety signal, the memory that says, this is no longer dangerous.
That's the one. And when it comes to PTSD, the hippocampus shows a highly consistent and frankly very troubling feature: volume reductions.
It physically shrinks.
It physically shrinks. This atrophy, this wasting away, is strongly correlated with how severe the patient's symptoms are.
And that is the physical mark of long-term stress, isn't it? The idea that sustained trauma leads to a chronic release of stress hormones like cortisol, and that cortisol is basically toxic to hippocampal neurons over time.
Absolutely. That chronic elevated state of arousal and stress seems to physically wear down and shrink this critical brain structure.
And the consequence of that shrinkage.
The consequence is that the shrunken hippocampus struggles to do its job. It struggles with context differentiation.
Which brings us right back to the story of the car backfiring in Paris.
Yeah.
The reduced hippocampus can't properly distinguish between the sound of real danger from years ago and the harmless sound of a car exhaust right now. It fails to provide the context of safety.
That is the very mechanism of a flashback. The amygdala alarm goes off, and the hippocampus fails to provide the updated, accurate context file that says, you are safe. You are in a cafe with a friend. You are not on that street in danger.
So that inability to integrate context means the threat response gets inappropriately generalized to safe things.
To anything that even vaguely resembles the original threat. So to just sum up this first part. The system is broken. It's defined by an underactive mPFC that is failing to inhibit an overactive amygdala, all while operating with a structurally compromised hippocampus that cannot provide the necessary safety signals.
And the entire goal of recovery, from a biological standpoint, has to be to somehow normalize that entire pattern.
That's the theory.
It's one thing to see this physical restructuring in someone who directly survived an attack. It's something else entirely to realize that this trauma can actually propagate outward, that it can infect the general population who only watched it unfold on a screen.
This is the era of collective trauma. Massive, tragic events are no longer geographically isolated. The 24-hour media cycle transforms them into global, repeated exposures for everyone.
We're talking about vicarious trauma.
Vicarious trauma, exactly. It's a secondary trauma that develops when someone just learns about, or more importantly, views violent traumatic events through media. And this exposure has a measurable negative psychological impact, even without any direct physical involvement.
It's the psychological cost of being a witness nonstop.
Right. And when the Paris attacks happened in November 2015, the media environment guaranteed that. Repeated, often very graphic exposure. For researchers, it was a perfect, if incredibly tragic, opportunity to study this propagation phenomenon scientifically.
And that led to this large-scale French population study, the ESPA study.
Yes, conducted 7 months after the attacks. This wasn't just, checking in a week later when everyone's still reeling. This was tracking the long-term psychological fallout across metropolitan France.
How many people were involved?
They recruited nearly 1,800 participants. And crucially, they were measuring post-traumatic stress symptoms, PTSS, in the general population. Not necessarily full-blown clinical PTSD, but the symptoms of it.
And the core question they were asking was, essentially, can watching the news actually damage your mental health?
The answer was a resounding yes. And it demonstrated a really stark dose-response effect related to media consumption.
A dose-response effect. So like a drug, the more you take, the bigger the effect.
Exactly. Specifically, the amount of time people spent viewing attack-related images on TV and the internet in the immediate 3 days following the event.
Let's break down those numbers because they're really convincing.
So they stratified the participants into low, medium, and high exposure groups. Low exposure was defined as watching less than 2 hours a day over those first 3 days.
Okay, that's the baseline.
Right. Now, compared to that group, individuals who reported medium exposure, that's 2 to 4 hours per day, showed significantly higher PTSS scores 7 months later.
Just from watching 2 to 4 hours of news.
They had shouldered a measurable psychological burden from it. And the high exposure group, those who consumed more than 4 hours per day, they showed an even greater psychological penalty.
Very much greater.
In the initial statistical pass, what's called a bivariate analysis, which just looks at the simple relationship between two things.
Media time and stress score.
Right. The high exposure group showed a 7.2-point increase in their PTSS score compared to the low exposure group. That is a massive, massive jump.
And I'm guessing people might say, well, of course they were more stressed. Maybe they knew someone in Paris or had a history of anxiety. But the researchers controlled for that, right?
They did. That's the power of the multivariate model. They ran the final model controlling for pretty much everything you can think of. Pre-event mental health history, demographic factors, how close they lived to Paris, whether they experienced other difficulties later on.
And the correlation still held up.
It did. Even with all those other variables accounted for, The high exposure group still showed a statistically significant 4.7-point increase in their PTSS score compared to the low exposure group.
Wow. So that really demonstrates that the media exposure itself is an independent, substantial contributor to long-term distress.
The mechanism of fear propagation is highly efficient. But it wasn't just traditional TV news. The study also zeroed in on the unique psychological risk of social media.
Ah, of course, the social media factor.
It was extremely significant. They found that using platforms like Facebook or Twitter to exchange information about the attacks was strongly associated with higher PTSS scores.
Can you quantify that for us?
Yes, the findings were quantified using what are called beta coefficients in the most adjusted model. Moderate social media use had a coefficient of 3.2, but high use shot that coefficient up to 6.8.
Okay, for our listeners, a beta coefficient is basically a measure of the strength of the relationship. So a coefficient of 6.8 means that holding all other factors constant.
For every unit increase in social media use, say from moderate to high, you see an average increase of 6.8 points on that PTSS score.
That's a huge psychological load attributed just to the medium itself. Why? What's the hypothesis for why social media is so much more potent?
Researchers think it's probably twofold. First, there's a total lack of editorial control.
Right. You're exposed to raw, unedited, potentially incredibly graphic content posted by witnesses or just random people, things that a traditional news outlet might censor or at least curate.
Exactly. And second, there's the interactive nature of the platform, the constant notifications, the emotional intensity of shared posts, the arguments in the comments. It becomes this unavoidable, repeated, visceral experience.
It's trauma without a filter, and it's buzzing in your pocket all day long.
That's a good way to put it. But it wasn't just the media dose that mattered. The study also clearly identified that individual vulnerability was a massive amplifier.
So some people were more susceptible to this media-driven trauma than others.
Much more. Even after they controlled for that media exposure, several individual factors greatly increased a person's risk of distress. For example, having a pre-event history of a mental health problem significantly amplified their susceptibility.
That makes sense. Their system is already a bit more fragile.
And listen to this one. Reporting a perceived lack of social support following the event resulted in a striking 8.1-point increase in the PTSS score.
An 8-point jump. That really underscores the buffering role of community, of connection. If your internal neural brakes are getting weak, having social support acts as a vital external stabilizer.
It's absolutely critical. And we also saw this concept of secondary adversity play out.
What's that?
People who experienced a non-traumatic but difficult situation after the attacks, so a major life stressor like a divorce or losing a job or severe illness, they showed a 5.1-point increase in their PTSS score.
So the collective trauma of the attacks left their system more sensitive, more brittle, less capable of handling the normal or even abnormal stresses of life that came later.
That's what it suggests. And this leads us to what is maybe the most critical concept from this part of the deep dive: stress sensitization.
Okay. How did the researchers use people's past trauma history to show that what you've been through before makes you more vulnerable to media trauma now?
This was a very elegant part of the study. They stratified the results based on whether the participant reported a lifetime trauma prior to the 2015 attacks. And the findings were stark.
What did they see?
For people who already had a history of trauma, meaning their neurological systems were already potentially sensitized, maybe that hippocampus was already a bit vulnerable, for them, even medium media exposure, that 2 to 4 hour bracket, was enough to trigger increased PTSS.
Wow. But for those without a prior history of trauma?
Their systems were more robust. For them, only the highest levels of media exposure, more than 4 hours a day, showed a significant association with increased PTSS.
That is compelling evidence for sensitization. If you have a history of adversity, your threshold for distress is just lower.
It's lower. Your mPFC, your brain's brake pedal, might already be operating at a slightly lower capacity. Therefore, the repetitive, vicarious trauma delivered through the media requires less force, if you will, to push you over the edge into symptomatic distress.
So the trauma becomes collective, but its effect is compound. It builds on a foundation of prior life challenges.
Precisely.
So we've established the physiological blueprint in the individual brain, and we've seen how that blueprint can be triggered or even mimicked by pervasive media exposure on a huge scale. Let's go back into the lab now. Because some of the newest and most profound insights are coming out of this ongoing French research effort, the program 13 November.
Yes. And the crucial insight here is that They're moving beyond the idea that PTSD is just about fear.
What do you mean?
Researchers started to recognize that the core problem might be something more generalized, a pervasive deficit in cognitive control over memory itself.
So a failure to hit the mental brakes, no matter what the memory is, whether it's scary or totally mundane.
Exactly. This research really challenges the idea that PTSD is only about the amygdala, the alarm being too loud. It suggests the problem is more fundamental. It's in the prefrontal cortex's ability to regulate the hippocampus, the memory filing cabinet.
So the team used a pretty clever experimental setup to test this, right? The think-no-think mechanism.
Yes, it's a very powerful paradigm. They brought in survivals of the 2015 attacks, some of whom had developed PTSD, and some who were resilient and hadn't, and they put them inside an fMRI scanner.
I love how elegant this experiment is in its simplicity. Can you walk us through the setup?
Sure. So first, outside the scanner, they trained the participants to associate completely neutral keywords with totally neutral images.
Give me an example.
For instance, they might learn to associate the word favor with a picture of a random elephant, or the word scissors with a picture of, a pair of scissors. The goal is to forge a strong, non-emotional link. So now the word favor automatically brings that elephant to mind.
Okay, the link is established. Then comes the suppression test inside the scanner.
Correct. When the cue word, like favor, appeared on the screen, it was color-coded. If it was green, the participant had to actively think about the elephant. That's the think condition.
It's left.
But if the word appeared in red, they had to do the opposite. They had to actively apply the mental brake and try to suppress the image of the elephant, forcing it out of their conscious awareness. That's the no-think condition.
Which requires the prefrontal cortex to actively step in and inhibit that memory retrieval process.
That's the task. And what the researchers were looking for was how efficiently those inhibitory control regions, the prefrontal cortex, were communicating with the memory center, the hippocampus, during that no-think task.
And what did they find when they compared the PTSD group to the resilient survivors?
The finding was striking. The individuals with PTSD showed much weaker functional connectivity between the inhibitory control regions of the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus compared to those without the disorder.
That's a direct observation of a neural connection deficit. The phone line between the two crucial structures just wasn't working properly when suppression was needed.
It fundamentally rewrites how we see the disorder. The problem isn't just that the amygdala is yelling too loud. It's that the specialized line of communication between the PFC, the controller, and the hippocampus, the memory system, is damaged or at least attenuated.
Which suggests the failure to inhibit memory retrieval is a generalized impairment. It's a universal broken brake for all unwanted thoughts.
Yes. If you struggle to stop yourself from thinking about a neutral picture of an elephant, how on earth can you possibly hope to suppress a life-altering, emotionally charged, traumatic memory?
That's the profound implication. The cognitive control mechanism is the same one. The one you need to suppress neutral images is the same one you need to suppress intrusive traumatic thoughts.
And in PTSD patients, that regulatory connection is compromised. The suppression mechanism just isn't working properly, regardless of the emotional content of the memory.
And they saw the consequences of this in the behavior of the participants too, right? It wasn't just in the brain scans.
Absolutely. In a final behavioral test after the scan, the participants with PTSD were actually quicker to identify or discern the familiar, neutral images that they had previously been instructed to suppress.
Which confirms that their attempt to suppress them had been less successful than the resilient groups.
Right. For them, the cognitive effort was spent, but the memory was still leaking through, just like a traumatic memory intrudes during a flashback. The simple act of not thinking about something is physically measurably harder for them.
This feels like a huge shift. It frames PTSD as fundamentally a disorder of cognitive control and inhibitory regulation, not just overwhelming emotion.
It does. And it also provides a much clearer target for potential interventions. If we can find a way to strengthen that communication pathway between the PFC and the hippocampus, we might be able to repair that generalized suppression deficit.
And that line of thinking is what's driving the next phase of their research, right? The Remember plus GABA project.
Yes. Now they're trying to go down to the molecular level.
Let's talk about that. What is GABA, and why is it the next logical step in this line of inquiry?
So GABA, or gamma-aminobutyric acid, is the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter in the entire brain. It is the chemical messenger whose main job is to block or slow down neural activity.
It's the brain's natural tranquilizer.
In a sense, yes. If the cognitive brakes are failing, GABA is the molecular fluid in that brake line. Researchers theorize that the deficit in memory suppression, that broken connectivity we just talked about, might be tied to a dysfunction in the GABAergic system within these specific inhibitory circuits.
So they're moving from mapping the networks to mapping the chemical function within those networks. How do you even study GABA in a living human brain?
It requires extremely advanced neuroimaging. Specifically, they're using positron emission tomography, or PD scans.
How does that work?
Researchers inject a specially designed radioactive tracer molecule that is engineered to bind specifically to GABA receptors in the brain. This allows them to visualize and quantify the density and the function of the inhibitory neurotransmitter system in real time in the specific regions they're interested in.
So the goal is to map the neurological process of resilience versus pathology at this incredibly granular molecular level.
Right. If they can show that lower GABA availability or function correlates with that weaker PFC hippocampus connectivity, then they've found a potential physical chemical target for a pharmacological intervention, or maybe even a specific type of therapeutic intervention.
It's like working backwards from the crime scene, from the observed behavioral and functional deficits all the way back to the underlying molecular pathology.
It's the cutting edge. This shift in focus from a general fear response to these very specific memory control deficits modulated by GABA represents the frontier in our neurological understanding of PTSD.
This brings us then to the biggest paradox of all. We have this increasingly clear neurobiological blueprint of damage. Hypoactivation in the front, hyperactivation in the middle, volume reduction, broken connectivity.
A pretty clear picture of what's wrong.
And yet we also have highly effective trauma-focused psychotherapies, things like cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, prolonged exposure, PE, and EMDR. If they work so well clinically, I mean, they must be reversing the damage, right? They must be physically fixing the brain.
That is the big question. It's called the normalization hypothesis, the idea that successful treatment should physically restore the brain's broken circuitry. It should upregulate the mPFC, dampen the amygdala, and maybe even reverse that hippocampal atrophy.
It seems logical.
It does. So a rigorous, systematic review went out and aggregated all the data from 24 different studies that used structural or functional MRI measurements before and after these therapies.
And what did they find? A clean reversal?
Well, they are far from a clean reversal.
Okay, let's start with the one piece of evidence that seems to support the theory. The executive center, the mPFC. We know it's hypoactive or underactive in PTSD. Does therapy strengthen it? Does it bring it back online?
This was the region that showed the most frequently observed change that was consistent with the hypothesis. They did see an increase in activation post-treatment.
So therapy helps strengthen that top-down control. It helps get the brakes working again.
It suggests that yes. This result was seen in 5 out of the 12 studies that were looking at functional activation.
Wait, only 5 out of 12?
Right, and that's why the systematic review still characterized this evidence as weak.
Because it's less than half.
It's less than half. More than half the studies found no significant change in mPFC activation at all. And even among the ones that did find changes, they were often pointing to slightly different subregions within that vast prefrontal network.
So while the trend sort of supports the idea of strengthening the brakes, the evidence isn't universal. It's not robust enough to declare that therapy consistently and predictably repairs the mPFC for all patients.
Exactly. It's a hint, but it's not a slam dunk.
Okay. Now, for what you called the biggest challenge to the normalization hypothesis, the amygdala, the hyperactive alarm, the theory dictates that successful therapy, by strengthening the mPFC, should cause the amygdala to quiet down. Does it?
Shockingly, no. At least not consistently. The findings for the amygdala are highly inconsistent, and they really challenge that standard model of recovery.
How inconsistent are we talking?
Of the 12 studies that were reviewed, the vast majority, 8 out of 12, reported no significant change at all in amygdala activation after successful treatment.
8 out of 12 found nothing. So you're saying that clinical recovery, the person feels better, their symptoms are gone, is happening without a detectable dampening of the alarm system in most of the patients they studied?
That's what the data says. Only 3 studies found the predicted post-treatment decrease in activation. And the real head-scratcher came from one study that was looking at mindfulness-based exposure therapy.
What did they find?
They reported a treatment-induced increase in left amygdala activation when patients were shown emotional stimuli, like pictures of angry faces.
Hold on. If the patient is successfully recovered, why would their fear center become more active after treatment, not less? That seems to completely contradict the idea of normalization.
It does. And it forces us to completely reconsider what neurological recovery actually looks like. It suggests that successful treatment isn't simply about, turning the volume down on the alarm.
So what could it be about?
It might be about faster, more efficient processing. Perhaps that heightened activation reflects the patient processing the potential threat very rapidly, but then it's followed by an immediate and successful extinction signal from that newly strengthened mPFC.
So the amygdala still fires hard and fast, but the mPFC now handles the regulation so effectively that the person is no longer subjectively distressed by it.
That's a leading hypothesis, that recovery in this view is not a quiet amygdala, but a well-managed amygdala.
That's a profound distinction. You're saying this neural pattern of recovery might actually be a new compensatory strategy, not a reversal back to a pre-trauma state.
Yes. The brain figures out a new way to cope that doesn't necessarily look normal on the scanner. The key thing to watch, then, wouldn't be the activity of the amygdala in isolation, but the functional connectivity between the mPFC and the amygdala.
But overall, these null results really challenge the simple idea that turning down the amygdala is central to getting better.
It's much more complex than that.
Okay, let's move to the hippocampus, the memory and context center. We established that trauma causes physical volume loss. First, did therapy change the function of the hippocampus? Did its activity patterns change?
In terms of functional activation, there is virtually no converging evidence whatsoever.
None.
Just about. Only one of the functional studies reported a small, limited increase in activation, but the finding was so isolated and lacked enough rigor that you really can't draw any conclusions from it. Successful psychological treatment does not appear to consistently alter the activation patterns of the hippocampus.
Okay, so function doesn't change. What about the structural damage? Does successful therapy cause a corresponding regrowth or increase in volume? Does the hippocampus get physically bigger again?
This is perhaps the greatest structural disappointment for the normalization hypothesis, despite that very strong evidence for structural damage, for hippocampal volume reduction in PTSD patients. The review found no converging evidence that successful therapy leads to a predictable, significant increase in volume.
In any brain region.
In any brain region, but especially not in the hippocampus.
So we have a clinical treatment that resolves the symptoms, but it seems to leave the physical structure of the memory center, well, still altered, still shrunken.
That's the heavy question hanging over the entire field. Only 1 out of 6 morphological studies reported a significant total hippocampal volume increase after treatment, and that result has not been reliably replicated by other groups.
What does that mean? Are we successfully treating the symptoms but not necessarily healing the underlying structural wound caused by all that chronic stress?
It suggests that while functional reorganization is possible, the brain is plastic, it can learn new coping circuits. Restoring neurogenesis and reversing structural atrophy is a much slower, much harder process.
It might require timescales longer than a typical course of therapy?
Or perhaps it requires a different type of biological intervention altogether.
It's just fascinating that we have this clear clinical success, but the physical roadmap of that success is so messy and inconsistent. Did the researchers find that one type of therapy, CBT, PE, EMDR, was better at causing these neural changes than the others?
Intriguingly, no. The systematic review found no diverging patterns of neural change associated with the different forms of successful psychotherapy.
So it didn't matter if a patient was doing cognitive restructuring or imaginal exposure or EMDR. The brain changes, however inconsistent they were, looked roughly the same.
They appeared to be driven by a common mechanism, yes.
And that suggests the core mechanism of action isn't specific to the therapy brand, but is tied to the fundamental process they all share.
Which is extinction learning. All of these trauma-focused treatments require the patient to face the trauma memory, to reconsolidate it, and to translate that repeated exposure into a stable, lasting safety signal. That's extinction learning. The neural alterations we do see are likely tied to the strengthening of the circuits responsible for that process, regardless of the specific technique used to get there.
Okay, before we wrap up this section on the fix, let's look at the predictive side. If tracking neural changes after therapy is so inconsistent, can we at least use brain scans before therapy to predict who is likely to respond well?
Yes, and this is actually a much more promising avenue for personalizing treatment. While the outcome scans were often ambiguous, the baseline neural activity before therapy started showed some surprising predictive value.
Really? What kind of baseline activity predicted a good outcome?
Higher pretreatment activation in specific areas like the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, the amygdala, and the insula were identified as potential predictors for a better treatment outcome.
That feels counterintuitive. I would think a quieter, less reactive brain would be easier to regulate.
But you're saying the more active those emotional and salience processing regions are before therapy, the better the result.
It is counterintuitive, and it raises a whole new set of questions. Are these individuals highly reactive but also highly engaged in the process? Is that baseline activity a sign that their system is already actively trying to engage coping mechanisms, even if it's failing?
Or maybe a higher baseline activation just means they have more metabolic resources available to dedicate to the incredibly difficult process of extinction learning during therapy.
It could be any of those things. But regardless of the reason, identifying these neural markers before treatment could one day help clinicians triage patients and potentially match them to the most appropriate therapeutic intensity or modality.
We've covered a tremendous amount of ground in this deep dive. We started with that microscopic biological alarm that can seize a person's entire body.
And we moved through the sociological mechanism of collective trauma, spread globally by our media environment. And we've concluded with this difficult, unresolved question of how we actually physically heal the system.
The synthesis, I think, is pretty clear. Trauma is deeply physiological. It impairs the brain's basic capacity for cognitive control over memory. The alarm system overrides the executive function, making something as simple as suppressing an unwanted thought emotional or not extraordinarily difficult. The brain has been physically altered.
And the research that followed the Paris attacks shows us that this fear, spread through the media, can lower the threshold for distress for an entire population, particularly for those who are already sensitized by prior adversity. It turns a localized tragedy into a pervasive public health issue.
And yet the greatest challenge remains that paradox of recovery. We know clinically that these trauma-focused psychotherapies are highly effective. People get better. But the physical roadmap of that healing, the predictable and consistent normalization of key brain structures like the amygdala and the hippocampus, remains highly inconsistent and poorly understood based on the current evidence.
It seems successful psychological treatment is tied to strengthening the prefrontal cortex, that brake pedal, allowing for enhanced top-down control. But precisely how that strengthened control resolves the underlying structural pathology, like the hippocampal volume loss, is still a fundamental question for neuroscience to solve.
It highlights that the brain's mechanism of recovery involves a complex compensatory network reorganization that our current neuroimaging methods are only just beginning to scratch the surface of. It's not a simple restoration of the original pre-trauma state. It's the building of something new.